Developers translating board and tabletop games into video games seem to select from a limited number of potential genres for their final video game product to adhere to. Tabletop RPGs like Shadowrun and Pathfinder will almost always become CRPGs, and a lot of their source rules remain intact during the translation. Infrequently, properties like Battletech will occupy a strategy-style genre, and sometimes developers take the game's setting and transform the entire experience into something new, like how Hired Gun is a first-person shooter. In 1995, a tiny English studio was contracted by Electronic Arts to create a game for the 3DO hardware. This game would be a translation of Games Workshop's Space Hulk board game, and would take tabletop translation to a wholly new place. Key Games would go on to create Space Hulk, Vengeance of the Blood Angels, a sequel to 1993's Space Hulk, and a more refined iteration of the same gameplay mechanics. The player would act as a squad leader within a unit of Blood Angels Terminators, and be tasked to lead their unit to complete various objectives, while navigating the treacherous mangle of ship corridors that had appeared from the warp. In order to competently lead their unit, the player must command their squad mates to move to advantageous positions, lay suppressing fire upon dangerous passageways, and collect objects in order to proceed. As a member of the unit, the player will also be required to complete some of these duties to ensure that the unit isn't overwhelmed by the array of enemies lurking in the Hulk. This means that the player must readily engage with the top-down real-time strategy systems, as well as the first-person shooter mechanics. Neglecting either side will cause the player to fail in their objectives, so they had better be ready and familiar with their chosen controller layouts. While Vengeance of the Blood Angels was originally developed for the 3DO, it would later be ported to Sony's PlayStation and Sega's Saturn, the latter of which I played. It isn't exactly a controller layout I'm familiar with, but I'll manage. For those unfamiliar, Space Hulk is a board game spin-off within Games Workshop's Warhammer 40,000 universe. The game involves a unit of players, the Blood Angels, exploring a mass of narrow corridors that are infested with Tyranid Genestealers. In the 40k universe, humanity often uses a parallel dimension to travel around the galaxy quickly, called the Warp. The Warp is exceedingly perilous, and many vessels will be lost within it. Occasionally, a mangle of ships will emerge from the warp as an enormous hulk, which is unfortunate for any human populations nearby. These hulks will often be infested with demons or Tyranids, or draw the attention of raiding orcs or traitor marines, so it's important that the hulk is either destroyed or sent back into the warp for someone else to deal with some other time. Destroying these immense tangles of old battleships can be extremely expensive, or could potentially cause problems for the human populations nearby, so the Space Marine factions will have no choice but to send units into the hulks to activate their warp drives internally. This is the case within Vengeance of the Blood Angels campaign, and it is the player's mission to activate that warp drive. While my experiences with Vengeance of the Blood Angels are mostly within the campaign setting, the game also features a number of other scenarios for the player to explore. Most evident among these are the one-to-one translations of the board game scenarios. The player will be thrust into these with the expectation that they understand what they're getting into. I say this because selecting the first mission does this.
Terminator flamers have been killed.
This setup is true to the board game scenario, and in that context it is totally fair and acceptable. The pieces are set out on the board and move in stages, so this xenomorph bum rush is a little more understandable. Other mission types allow the player to be commanded by the game, to gain an understanding of what their capabilities are, as well as get a feel for the controls. All of these modes are also unique in how they allow the player to swap their perspectives between each Terminator, which is not possible within the campaign. That campaign also begins with the player following orders. Gabriel will eventually gain command over the squad, but initially they aren't up to the task. This means that the campaign is primarily a first-person shooter for the first few missions, so that'll be a good place to start. Despite being released in the years following Wolfenstein 3D and Doom, Vengeance of the Blood Angels strays away from emulating their fast pace, and instead occupies an almost dungeon crawler style. The player's bolt pistol is not a hit-scan weapon, so the player must accommodate the projectile's travel time, as well as aim the shots along sight lines that the projectile could actually travel. The narrowness of the Hulk's interior spaces furthers the dungeon crawling feel, as there isn't much room for fast maneuvers, and, since the Terminator armor is bulky and cumbersome, Gabriel's movements weren't ever going to be done with any pace anyway. The enemies, however, are startlingly quick. Genestealers and their hybrid subordinates can cover distances in no time at all, so if the player manages to isolate themselves and is approached from multiple angles, it is almost a certainty that they will meet their demise. Genestealers will also wait around corners for the optimal time to strike out, so the player shouldn't stand too close to those corners. There is a melee attack, although the Power Fist is appropriately slow to match its lethality. Whenever a Genestealer manages to get within melee range of the player, they will engage a struggle scenario. The Genestealer will randomly select one of 5 animations to attack the player with, and the player must respond by pressing the attack button before the retaliation window closes. One of these animations has no retaliation window at all, so the player should not count on being able to survive the struggles. Hybrids, Chaos Marines, and the Magus have ranged attacks that the Terminators will recover from over time. I didn't notice that the Terminators were healing until about the 7th hour, when a Magus hit me with a fireball and I was forced to battle a swarm of Genestealers while waiting for the fire to subside. And by battling a swarm of Genestealers, I mean shooting at a single file line of them, barreling down a hallway toward me. The shortcomings within the first-person mechanics are made up for within the strategy mechanics. Since Gabriel isn't capable of covering all angles alone, he will be accompanied by a squad of up to 9 additional Terminators. Without command, these Terminators will stand in the designated location and shoot at any enemies that appear within their vision radius. The player commands their squad mates via a top-down map and a list of tasks in the upper right corner. The number of potential actions for a squad mate to take is impressively large, but scrolling through this big list of stuff with a single button is very tedious. Further, the player only gets a short period of thinking time before the enemies are reactivated whenever they open the strategic map. So there are a lot of problems with this style of control. For instance, if the player has a relatively large number of other Terminators within their command, and some complex objective that requires tasking multiple squad mates to complete, the likelihood that they will be able to issue all of those orders before thinking time ends is very low. The player only regains thinking time when the strategic map is closed. This can also mean that if something urgent must be queued in the commands, and the player cannot afford to allow thinking time to elapse while menuing, the imprecision of the controls will come to bear. As a reminder, I played this game on Saturn hardware using a standard Saturn controller, but it was also available on PlayStation and 3DO. Much like the Saturn controller, the 3DO controller lacked analog controls, and Sony wouldn't introduce their analog controller until 1997. This game is designed to be played with a D-pad alone. Turning speed is a big problem. Since movement and turning occupy a pseudo-grid-based system, things like commanding Terminators to move around is quite simple, but first-person movement is much less so. All movements and turns are not entirely linked or disconnected from the grid, and I think this middle ground is quite destructive to the overall controls. Angling the player's perspective away from the grid can allow them to shoot down corridors that they wouldn't be able to if they were entirely locked to the grid, but being able to position the view in that way is not an easy task. I never found a consistent way to angle the view to take advantage of cover while shooting down a corridor. And since none of the characters' movements are linked to the grid in any significant way, in wider spaces enemies can weave around and be very difficult to consistently track. I ultimately resorted to using my squad mates as a defensive bubble for myself whenever a mission required navigating through an open room. There are a variety of missions within Vengeance of the Blood Angels, although the game is quite hesitant to use most of them. The missions can vary between tasking the player to move all surviving Terminators to a particular location, to retrieving an item, killing a specific enemy, or activating interactive nodes. Most missions within the campaign are traversal missions, which makes a lot of the available commands frequently useless. There's no use to use pickup commands when there are no objects to pick up, but the player will have to scroll past those commands every time. Activatable nodes are also very rare, and generally achieve the same function as the traversal objectives. The player needs to get somewhere to press a button. Killing specific enemies is interesting. The Magus enemies are the most frequently targeted, and fighting them is the most intense experience in the game. Magus will typically occupy an area with a number of Genestealer spawners nearby, and they'll be positioned at the end of a long hallway. This means the player will have to cope with a fireball spell that leaves a damage zone on the ground that can kill Terminators if they aren't careful, while also fending off the swarming Genestealers. One of these Magus targets was a huge thorn in my progression, and I had to peek around a corner to even damage it, because the 3 times I reached it previously ended in fiery failure. The Magus also exemplifies a visual inconsistency among the character sprites. The Terminators and the Genestealers are turnaround renders of 3D models, similar to the techniques used for the Donkey Kong Country games, while the hybrids, Magus, and Chaos Marines are not created in the same way. They are uncommon, but whenever they do appear, they clash with the other character sprites. The Chaos Marines look quite bad, but everyone else is pretty cool. The environment textures are very basic, but I like them. And the draw distance helps the Hulk feel oppressive and abandoned. It's unfortunate that the Hulk layouts aren't especially inspired. Every level is a mixture of narrow corridors and wider spaces, with varying quantities of Genestealer spawners. While it is true that the entire campaign takes place within the same space Hulk, a Hulk is definitionally composed of multiple ships squeezed together, so there should really be more variation between the environments. The mission briefing room is awful, and the voice lines are disastrously bad. Not only is the performance mediocre, but the lines themselves were not written to convey any kind of narrative stakes, or even a series of connected events.
Brothers, we have no clear path forwards. We must look to the Emperor for guidance in the knowledge that good shall always prevail over evil. Make haste, brothers, we must not fail. Brothers, the enemy has wilted before us. Good has prevailed over evil, and our mission seems nearly complete. Progress to the warp drive control room and activate the drive. Glory to the Emperor.
Often, the player will be told that their commander has no plan, and they should just walk further into the Hulk. That's it. Was it that difficult to think of a narrative through line to string these campaign missions together? I doubt anyone would have playtested this campaign and thought that this was acceptable. The narrative is only one of many parts of the game that are half-baked. There's a consistent failure in loading priorities that continually forces the player back out of levels. Whenever a player enters a level, they have to wait for the game to load the whole thing. It has to happen sometime, so this is fine. If the player fails their objective, either by dying or allowing required squad mates to die or whatever, then the game unloads the entire level and goes back to the menu. The failure message is relayed, and then the player is given the option to retry. Why? Why unload the level to ask if the player wants to retry, and then have to reload the level if they choose to reattempt immediately? This seems like a very elementary issue to overcome within software development to me. It takes far fewer resources to reset a few variables, including positions in a 3D space, than it does to load all of that information anew. And with the rampant randomness throughout the game, there's a fair chance the player will have to retry missions multiple times. Enemy spawns are random. Sometimes the player can advance through an area no problem, and other times that area is a multi-minute battle as a constant stream of Genestealers continually spawn and rush into the fray. Weapon jams occur randomly. A Terminator's bolter will stop being able to fire for a random period of time, which could allow a Genestealer to rush up to them and attack. The struggles scenarios are random. When they attack the player, the Genestealer will select a random attack that could not allow the player to even fight back. And if they attack a squad mate, there's a fairly high probability that the Genestealer will win the hand-to-hand, since both characters are randomly choosing their attacks. So failing a mission because a few random events didn't go the player's way will force them through a loading screen to a choice to sit through another loading screen and potentially better luck, or to shut the game off. As much as I'd love to recommend every game I make a video about to anyone that watches, sometimes the lengths they would have to go in order to engage are not worthwhile. Getting a hold of the game isn't incredibly difficult, but even if you already possess the necessary hardware to play the game, I would still argue that the effort is wasted. Vengeance of the Blood Angels wasn't a cult hit or anything, and what you'll find here is a solid enough game, but nothing special. Additionally, I was reluctant to play a Warhammer game, given Games Workshop's deplorable actions recently, but this game is long enough disconnected that my concerns didn't obstruct me. In the end, Space Hulk Vengeance of the Blood Angels isn't a good adaptation of the board game, nor do the changes elevate it to something noteworthy. Had Key Games chosen to create a dungeon crawler, a tactics game, or a first-person shooter, I'd imagine the result being a lot more coherent and much more enjoyable. This middle ground inhibits the player from scrounging any joy from either mechanical system, instead permitting them to languish in the awkwardness of the controls, or spend their precious video game time looking at the loading screen. There are better Space Hulk games, there are better Saturn games, there are better loading screens. Next week, I hope not to draw too much ire from the creator of the game,